So I first became familiar with the word ahimsa, which can be roughly translated as non-harming, non-injury, or non-violence. Well, I learned it through the study of classical yoga, as set out in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is the defining text of yoga, millennia old. And as you might know, yoga is more than stretching. The stretching part, called asana, is only one of the 8 limbs of yoga. The 8 limbs of yoga are the yamas, which are known as the abstinences, the niyamas, which are the observances, asana, which is the postures, pranayama, which is breathing, pratyahara, which is withdrawal, dharana is concentration, dhyana is meditation, and samadhi is absorption. And you don't need to remember all of that. It's just that, except for the fact that yoga is more than stretching. But also that ahimsa is part of the 8 limbs of yoga. It is one of the yamas, one of the abstinences. It's a Sanskrit word for non-harming, and it is part of the first limb of yoga. The yamas involve, in addition to ahimsa, the yamas involve abstinence from things like lying and stealing and greed or being consumed by sex. In addition to all these, there is ahimsa, abstaining from harm. And as with many words that are translated, sometimes the deeper meaning gets lost in the translation, or the full meaning, or the nuance of the meaning gets lost. So this translation of ahimsa to nonviolence or non-harming doesn't really tell the whole story. Swami Satchidananda, who was the yogi who was at Woodstock and was based in Virginia before he passed away, I believe, in the 90s, he wrote a big commentary of the Yoga Sutras. And in this commentary, he describes ahimsa. And he says, when the vow of ahimsa is established in someone, all enmity ceases in their presence because that person emits harmonious vibrations. If 2 people who have enmity between them come to such a person, they will temporarily forget it. That is the power of ahimsa. He says when it is practiced continuously in thought, word, and deed for some time, the entire personality brings out these vibrations that can be felt by others. Going on, he says, even wild animals forget their nature of causing pain in the presence of one established in ahimsa. In ancient Hindu mythology, it states that in the forests where the saints and the sages lived practicing non-harming, practicing ahimsa, the animals would only kill when they were hungry. At other times, a cow and tiger could drink water side by side, kind of like the lion and the lamb. Swami Satchidananda says Lord Buddha also cultivated this practice. Wherever he went, he brought peace, harmony, and friendliness. He says St. Francis is another example of ahimsa. And the Swami talks about Gandhi. He says Gandhi tried his best to practice and propagate ahimsa, bringing many people together. Of course, there were failures in his efforts, but he would admit, I am still trying. I am still not that perfect. Gandhi's entire life was based on the vows of ahimsa and satya. Satya means truth. So even without obtaining 100% perfection in his ahimsa, he earned a great name throughout the world as an apostle of peace. And he goes on to say, which I think is quite interesting, perhaps if Gandhi's practice of ahimsa had been perfected, his assassin might have forgotten the idea of shooting him when he came into Gandhi's presence. But I think the bottom line here, well, he says, even with a little imperfection, Gandhi was admired and revered by the entire world and achieved the liberation of India from colonial rule. So the point here, I think, is that even a little bit of ahimsa can elevate us to a higher state of being, whether or not we are perfect. I find reassurance in the fact that Gandhi did not practice his own nonviolence absolutely perfectly, because ahimsa, total non-harming, is really, really hard, right? It's so different from what we are taught to be, how we are taught to be as human beings. And especially because it transcends more than just doing physical harm. It's really about refraining from harmful thoughts, words, and actions. And there's a point to this. Harmful thoughts, words, and actions do have repercussions, right? They have repercussions on our own selves, and they have repercussions out in the world. And negative feelings, when we express negative feelings, they can do damage as well. Words that are said or actions that are undertaken can really have far-reaching consequences. And even when we don't express them, we think we're not expressing them, but they can still be harmful because those thoughts we don't share can still lead us to do things that are undesirable, that may harm others. So what does a practice of non-harming actually look like? Well, the yogis tell us that we are actually practicing compassion for all living things, for all of creation. It says we are considerate of others and are mindful of the consequences of our actions on other people. And at our very best, we put the needs of others before our own. We think before we speak and act. Ahimsa calls us to be compassionate and gentle with ourselves, too. No self-harm. Taking care of our physical and mental health. Not abusing our bodies, and not becoming overwhelmed with self-doubt or self-criticism, or even for some, the idea of self-hatred. And of course, the way to cultivate ahimsa is through self-examination and self-study. Basically studying those things we don't really want to, we don't feel like studying, are negative thoughts and emotions. But when we have increasing self-observation, we become more aware of this negative internal dialogue. And we realize that this negative internal dialogue might be projecting out into the world in ways we hadn't really thought about. And then if we do this self-examination, there are many ways to do it, through contemplation, through meditation. We finally realize that our thoughts are things we've manufactured in our heads and things that we are kind of inflicting upon ourselves, our disturbing thoughts, and that with enough practice and self-awareness, you can actually control them. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not be free of a negative thought ever, but you can no longer be ruled by your negative thoughts. Most of the negative thoughts and emotions that lead us to harm ourselves and others, especially anger, right? Those really negative emotions, most of them are generated by fear. You look under anger, anytime there's always some kind of fear there. So our self-examination could involve, kind of uncovering the fears underlying a lot of our feelings. And then we can look at those fears and go, are they rational? Has anyone here ever had an irrational fear that never came true? I'll admit to it. Yeah, we do this stuff. Are those fears rational? Are they warranted? Does this fear serve any purpose for anyone in the world at all? Many times, no. But doing this process, you're more likely to be able to let go of that fear before you have a chance to harm yourself or harm anyone else. And, this ability to move in the world with a minimum of negative thoughts and emotions, including anger and fear, really does make a difference. It can have, let's just say if everyone did that, if everyone reduced their negative thoughts and emotions, therefore their negative actions by 10%, the world might be a 10% happier and peaceful place. A famous yoga teacher by the name of BKS Iyengar, he wrote, "The yogi fears none, and none fear him, because he is purified through the study of the self." Similarly, one of the Yoga Sutras says, "In the presence of one firmly established in ahimsa, all hostilities cease." So, with Gandhi being the most well-known practitioner of ahimsa, I'm going to share with you his own description of what it meant to him. He said, literally speaking, ahimsa means non-killing. But to me, it has a world of meaning and takes me into realms much higher infinitely higher. It really means that you may not offend anybody. You may not harbor any uncharitable thought, even in connection with one who may consider himself to be your enemy. To one who follows this doctrine, there is no room for an enemy. But there may be people who consider themselves to be his enemies, so it is held that we may not harbor an evil thought even in connection with such persons. If we return blow for blow, we depart from our doctrine of Ahimsa. Gandhi continues, but I go farther. If we resent a friend's action or the so-called enemy's action, we still fall short of this doctrine. But when I say we should not resent, I do not say that we should acquiesce. By the word resenting, I mean wishing that some harm should be done to the enemy or that he should be put out of the way, not even by any action of ours, but by the action of somebody else or by, say, divine agency. If we harbor even this thought, this resentment, we depart from the doctrine of nonviolence. So that's a really high bar Gandhi is setting there, right? And for the most part, he really lived up to it, and it worked. Again, he was not a perfect practitioner. I don't think there's a perfect practitioner, but it really worked. But this was in every bit of his life, as you'll find out later. But I found this great story, I think, that really tells another kind of, gives another really vivid example of ahimsa. In traditional Indian lore, there's a story about an old Hindu monk who was sitting on the bank of a river silently repeating his mantra, as monks are wont to do. Nearby, a scorpion fell from a tree into the river before him, and the monk graciously saved the scorpion from the river and returned it to its tree. But on the way, the scorpion bit his hand. The monk sat down again and resumed his mantra. Again, the scorpion fell into the river, and the monk pulled it out of the river, put it back in the tree, and got bitten again. Well, this happened a few times over and over and over. And it happened that a villager, who didn't know so much about the ways of holy men like this monk, he had come to the river for the water and had observed this whole scorpion scenario play out with the monk. And unable to contain himself, the agitated villager told the monk, I have seen you save that stupid scorpion several times now, and each time it has bitten you. Why just not let him drown? Brother, replied the monk, the scorpion cannot help himself. It is his nature to bite. Well, agreed, answered the villager. But knowing this, why don't you leave him in the river if he's going to bite you? Ah, brother, replied the monk, you see, I cannot help myself either. I am a human being. It is my nature to save. So I doubt few of us have ever achieved the spiritual enlightenment of this monk. I certainly have not. And I was just really glad reading this story for the first time that the monk did not go into anaphylactic shock. But I think this parable really demonstrates the radical type of non-harming we're talking about, the kind Gandhi practiced. And this idea that when you adopt ahimsa and it becomes part of your nature, how it can transform the way you react to things, even to things that bite you over and over. In the great law book of Hinduism, it is written, Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, meaning ahimsa is the highest law. Non-harming is the highest law. Think about that. Gandhi said, non-violence is the law of our species, as violence is the law of the brute. The spirit lies dormant in the brute, and he knows no law but that of physical might. The dignity of man requires obedience to a higher law, to the strength of the spirit. So to Gandhi, the strength of the spirit through ahimsa is not a weak thing. It's actually a powerhouse. It's a place to derive intense, extreme power. It suggests a dynamic state of mind in which this power is this power of non-harming is brought into the world. Gandhi said, strength does not come from physical capacity. It comes from an indomitable will. Right? He saw ahimsa as latent in the depths of human consciousness. He thought this inner strength could be cultivated by the observance of complete ahimsa. Violence, he said, curbs the energy within. It's an energy negating kind of thing. And it's, and violence also, he believed, didn't really solve anything. It really just kind of took this energy and it would pop up again, through resentment and through, underlying hostility that violence brings. But he saw ahimsa properly understood and in practice as invincible, that confident. And he said, with satya, truth, combined with ahimsa, Gandhi wrote, you can bring the whole world to your feet. He thought of truth in also a very expansive way. Truth was God, God was truth. Truth was also an ultimate concern, an ultimate purpose. Gandhi saw his practice of ahimsa and his personal practice throughout his life. He saw it as a science. He said, I've been practicing with scientific precision, nonviolence and its possibilities for an unbroken period of over 50 years. So I imagine he would have learned something over that time. He said he had applied it in every walk of life, domestic, institutional, economic, and political, and he knew no single case in which it had failed. So, in other words, Gandhi was about the widespread application of nonviolence. And he didn't like it to be just a theory. He said it's not a cloistered virtue to be practiced by the individual for his peace and his final salvation, but it is a rule of conduct for society. To practice nonviolence in mundane matters is to know its true value. So if you do it in your everyday life, that's how you learn to get it. And it's to bring heaven upon earth. He said, I hold it therefore to be wrong to limit the use of nonviolence to cave dwellers, monastics, and for acquiring merit for a favored position in the other world. So, you don't do nonviolence, so you'll maybe get to heaven or just have some karmic reward. He says, all virtue ceases to have use if it serves no purpose in every walk of life. So nonviolence, ahimsa, was an everyday, all day long kind of thing. And this really came from his experience of it as the only way to fully resolve conflict. And he really thought, you wouldn't get it unless you actually tried to practice it. He said he did not appreciate people who wrote about nonviolence who didn't practice it. People who studied it who didn't practice it. He had really no use for that. He said if one doesn't practice nonviolence in one's personal relationships with others, one is vastly mistaken. This is a good one. Nonviolence, like charity, must begin at home. He said, ahimsa is not the crude thing it has been made to appear. Not to hurt any living thing is no doubt part of ahimsa, but it is its least expression. So not killing stuff, that's just that's the basic understanding. The principle of ahimsa is hurt by every evil thought, by undue haste, by lying, by hatred, by wishing ill on anybody. And I think what is, I believe, a statement about greed and selfishness, he says, ahimsa is also violated by our holding on to what the world needs. So I think that begs the question for us, how can we cultivate ahimsa when we have been trained by this sort of aggressive and individualistic and self-serving culture to kind of do the opposite of that? Go for it, get what you want. And there aren't a lot of easy answers, or answers that don't involve a lot of work. Ahimsa, nonviolence are countercultural. They go against the grain of much we've been taught on how to do things and how to be. There is so much we have to unlearn and relearn, so much introspection and self-awareness to cultivate through contemplation, to cultivate through spiritual practice. And yeah, it sounds a little naive, every beauty queen wants world peace, right? World peace. We kind of almost snicker at that, that exclamation now. It sounds a little naive and unrealistic to think that we can change the world by working on ourselves, by working on peace within ourselves. But in a world where so much is out of our control, maybe we should focus on the part we can control and have some agency, which is over ourselves and how we act and how we are in the world. Like Gandhi said, nonviolence must begin at home. So may we together support one another in the cultivation of this non-harming, this ahimsa that Gandhi found to be so powerful and effective. For our own personal peace, for our relationships, and for peace in our world. May it be so.